Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester, Director of Public Programs, and it's a pleasure to have you all here for tonight's conversation with artist E.J. Hill and art historian David Getsy. E.J. Hill received his undergrad degree from Columbia College in Chicago and his Master's of Fine Arts from right here at UCLA. His work has been exhibited at the Studio Museum, the Whitney, Mass MoCA, the Aspen Art Museum, Pinchuk Art Center in Kiev, the Institut d'Art Contemporain in France, as well as at LACMA and, of course, here at the Hammer Museum. He's received numerous honors, including fellowships from United States artists and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, the Durfee Foundation Stanton Fellowship, the Joan Mitchell Foundation's Painters and Sculptors Grants, the Artadia Los Angeles Award, a Foundation for Contemporary Arts grant, and a grant from the Art Matters Foundation. We're so excited to have EJ back at the Hammer because we were all so blown away by his contribution to the Hammer's 2018 Made in LA Biennial, which was curated by Erin Christovale and Ann L. Good. And I want to give a shout out to all the other folks from the curatorial team of the 2018 Biennial who are in the audience tonight. So nice to have you back. At the core of E.J. Hill's practice is a form of durational performance that reflects both the hardships that certain bodies are forced to endure and the enormous resilience of those bodies. His work insists that we look at how our society's deeply held prejudices and inequalities continue to place Black, brown, and queer bodies at risk of violence, and his work can be as painful to contend with as it is essential to witness. E.J.'s Hammer Biennial installation, called Altar for Victors Past, Present, and Future, was a room-sized sculpture with a podium at the center, of the kind where Olympic athletes receive their medals. Before the opening, he underwent a ritual series of runs, or I would call them victory laps, around the perimeters of all the educational institutions he had ever attended. And then, throughout the entire 2018 Made in LA exhibition, during every hour that the museum was open to the public, 6 days a week for 3 months, Hill physically stood on top of the center podium. It was incredibly powerful to witness. Now he's returned as a guest curator for the latest iteration of our exhibition series called Houseguest, in which a contemporary artist is invited to create an exhibition from the collections of the Hammer and the Grunwald Center for the Graphic Arts. E.J.'s exhibition, Mute Flesh, was composed over months of visits to the Grunwald Center, and in it he explores traces and transcendence in works by Eve Fowler, Barbara T. Smith, Charles White, David Warnerovich, and others, many of whom play on the associative capacity of the color pink. Mute Flesh is on view at the Hammer until August 25th, and if you have not seen it already, you have to come back and spend some time in the galleries because it's an absolute treasure trove. When we asked EJ if he was interested in doing any kind of talk or programs during the exhibition, he immediately asked if we could have David Getsy here, and we are thrilled that Getsy said yes. He's the Eleanor Shea Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago we were talking so much about University of Chicago, but the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and his books include the award-winning Queer Behavior, Scott Burton and Performance Art from University of Chicago Press, Abstract Bodies, 60 Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender, and Rodin, Sex and the Making of Modern Sculpture, both from Yale University Press, as well as an anthology of artists' writings called Queer, published by MIT. After tonight's discussion, we welcome you all to join us and continue the conversation over some light refreshments outside of the theater. And if you'd like to stay updated on our upcoming events and programs, please be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter, and you can do that outside at the reception area. We have several upcoming after-hours tours of our summer exhibitions that you won't want to miss. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming E.J. Hill and David Getsy. Thank you.
Hi, y'all. Hi there, and thank you for coming. Well, first, I just want to congratulate you on the exhibition. It's just gorgeous, and there's lots of play in it as well. So I think we should just dive in, and I just want to sort of ask you the first basic question, which is, how did you come to the idea for the exhibition and the selection of works?
I started with some visits to the study room in the Grunwald Center, and Jenny Waldo was the one who kind of helped me sort of make sense of it all in the beginning because I went in and there's about 45,000 different works in the collection, and I had no idea where to start. And so I went in on the first day into the guts of the museum, all of these shelves, and was just kind of like, what's in that box? And what's in that one? And I could sense that, like, my approach was just kind of to like feel my way through it. And then at one point, they were like, so is there a certain time period or an artist or region of the world that you want to check out? And I just kind of dug in the stacks for a while. So it came like really organically, but I was, this is the first time I've ever done anything like this, so I didn't quite know where to start. So I really wanted to, I wanted to feel, yeah, I wanted it to sort of like unfold on its own, hoping that like something would come together in the process. I think it did. I hope it did.
So, do you see it as something that relates to your work or that departs from your work, up to this point at least?
I think yeah, I think it relates, and I wanted it to feel really authentic in a way because I came at it with like a sort of like research brain, and I wanted to go deep and like do all of this reading, and then that didn't really feel like how it didn't really feel like me. It felt like I was sort of like cosplaying as someone else, or like like the curators that I know and love. Shout out Aaron. But it felt, I wanted it to feel like I wanted it to feel like me, and a lot of that had to do with just like feeling something in the gut and not really knowing what it was, or not being able to articulate it, but knowing the feeling, and then just like chasing a sensation, like a very physical sensation.
Yeah, and it's a very visceral show. Again, I hope you've all had a chance to see it, but there's a lot of emphasis on questions of bodies and contact, but also kind of a moving in close and then pushing us back far. Um, and that's really one of the key themes of the show is it centers on the body and the figure as well, because the show is full of body parts, and a smattering of figures, but it really does kind of oscillate between seeing or imagining a body and then having it dissolve into a landscape or an abstraction. Um, but your text for the show, right? Which is purports to give us an entry into it. And it's actually two texts. One is a poem. One is prose. Really emphasizes questions of sensuality and sexuality, um, and that is a new feature or a departure from your previous work. Has that been so overt in other projects up to this point?
Yeah, no, it does feel really new, and it feels kind of scary actually. I was taking, or am taking, a leap. I made a series of neon works in 2020, in I think April of 2020. So we were just still kind of at the beginning of the lockdown restrictions and not totally understanding what the coronavirus was, and everyone was still like completely freaked out. And I remember being really, um, I'm kind of a homebody anyway, and I like my quiet alone time. But I remember, even for me, that time being really intense and just being so starved for physical connection in a way that I had never really felt before. And so I still wonder if like I was starved because I couldn't have it, like it was so transgressive to be close to someone at that time. Everyone being 6 feet apart from one another. I made these neons that sort of spoke to that sentiment and like me longing for touch, and all of them were kind of, coy. They weren't like so direct. I think the most direct is probably the one that's above the gallery door, which reads, "Consume with reckless abandon this unholy communion," and then, titling it Kiss. And so, like, thinking about touching another and being so close to somebody that you're inside of them or being consumed by them. Another one read, "Gape and flood until all comes untethered." And so there's these like really poetic phrases, but at the root of it, it was just kind of like, I really need to be touched, and that's new for me because I don't know. I think I operate usually in a visceral sense. Like a lot of the performance work is really true embodiment to the nth degree, and it's sweaty and it's bloody and it's yeah, it's body, it's there. But this sort of sensuality slash sexuality, I think, really came from a time where like we were all very wary of one another, and rightfully so.
And really thinking about those, not just the moments of contact, but the moments of blending between two people at that point of touch. And this is really what cumulatively the exhibition does, I think, in some really interesting ways, is that, and I explained it in formal dynamics before, but I'll just re-describe it here, that it brings us both close and far to the figure or the body. It shows us parts, it gives us allusions to other parts, and kind of holds us up close as we move from one work to the next. And that is very much about that proximity that happens with something like a kiss or with sexual contact or intimacy, is that vision no longer works because you're too close to another person. And it's interesting how the show starts, if you go from left to right, with the John Wesley that seems to intimate genitals or a kind of sexual looking, and then quickly we move to an abstraction. And then we move on to another, like the Helen Frankenthaler abstraction. And that is this way of moving close and far away. Um, I think there's some ways in which we can tie that, though, to some of the other themes of your work as well, because one of the things you've done in your endurance performances, where you're visible and on display for all gallery visitors, those are spectacular transformations of your presence and your body into an image, right? And that was very much part of that work. But then you've also done works that refuse to be conventionally visible. Um, my favorite is the project you did for the 2022 Whitney Biennial, in which your sole contribution was a pink page in the catalog, right? And so that's a radical refusal of this kind of spectacle of the artist and of yourself. So how do these relate then? Is this a rethinking of that same trajectory of moving from the kind of spectacular visibility of the body to its to the refusal of that kind of scrutiny?
Yeah, that's thank you. That's one of my I love that work. A lot of people still don't know I was even in that show, which I find really lovely and kind of hilarious. I had friends texting me being like, "Hey, like what floor is your work on? Like I'm here at the museum," and I would just like sigh with like such pride. But I think a lot of what I do and a lot of what I make is coming from, it's just coming from like a place where I'm just trying to survive and thrive and love and live. And so it's not always as maybe premeditated as it might seem. I think the Whitney work came after so I work with a few organizations and community nonprofits that are very near and dear to my heart that I don't really talk about a whole lot to press or in events like this. And so like I keep certain things really protected, but I view it as very much a part of my work, and it sort of like ties into a sort of ethic that I feel like not everything needs to be screamed from the rooftops. Not everything needs to be posted to socials. I think some work is simply about just doing it, just like being on the ground and laboring alongside the collaborators and communities that the work is for. And so there's this sort of more fugitive side to my practice that doesn't traffic within gallery and museum systems, and I prefer that. And so the Whitney Project actually, wow, this is crazy. This is like the first time I'm actually talking about this, which I'm gonna try to not be like too withholding, but um, that project came out of like 2 years of speaking with Adrian Edwards and David Breslin, the curators of that edition, about wanting to pull in one of my community projects into the museum and sort of like redirect resources and funding and access from the museum to this organization. And then the further we got in that, I just decided like this feels kind of gross. Like I don't like this isn't about sort of like waving a flag like look at all the great things I'm doing like in the world. And so what David and Adrian helped me do was like all of the things that we talked about, which is like utilizing the museum's reach and resources to support an organization. And so the people who like know about how we worked are the people who worked on the project. And so the sort of representation of that is a kind of like gesture that says this isn't for you, like this is for us, and like here's an offering, but it doesn't need to be in the museum. It doesn't need to be on a wall. We just like sort of did this like reversal, and that's to this day one of my favorite projects. And I also love that while the rest of the works got deinstalled, packed up, and shipped to wherever they went, my work still like exists in the hands of the people for like the price of a catalog, and that like feels really good to me. And so a lot of the works in this show, I'm kind of just like oscillating between being hyper visible and overexposed, and the exhaustion that I feel from that. Especially, this was also coming out of a time where like black portraiture was like at a zenith, and everyone was like eating it up, and I felt that some of the engagement with that work was very insincere, or to like just to certain ends that felt like vampiric. And so like I was kind of like I feel like I'm about to be eaten alive, and like this isn't even the sort of base of my work, but I do create images in my work with like me and my body front and center. And so that was kind of at the same time I'm like pulling away. And so I'm just kind of like at the end of the day, I think just trying to preserve my peace.
Well, yeah, any display of the body or of the figure kind of incites voracious and hungry categorization. And it's so easy for that, the display of the figure or the body um, to suddenly become representative of those categories that are used. Um, uh, you know, Societal categories to rank and hierarchize people, and it is exhausting to always have to do that. And especially as a performance artist who did these long form endurance practices, that was a daily encounter with becoming a spectacle. And the antidote to that is to do things that are unseen or that are hard to visualize. And sometimes the most effective things are things that go unseen. Um, it's interesting to see that dynamic being played out in the exhibition too, where there's again, some very saucy work, right? That kind of promises more sexuality and sensuality, and then there's very cerebral registrations of the body, and the rhythm of the show kind of pushes back and forth, and I see it. Really related to the themes you were just talking about, as asking what the limits of showing the figure are. Um, in that show, there's really only one clear figurative representation which is the Charles White that anchors the gallery. Every other representation of the human form is fragmented or collaged or obscured or in shadow. And that work in particular seems like it sort of stands above the rest of them. And I was wondering if you could talk about the choice of that piece in particular, especially in light of these themes of both of spectacle and withholding.
Right. Yeah, I had a tough time. I really didn't want any representation in the show. Like, I was trying really hard to stray away from any figurative work, because I felt like there, for a lot of the reasons we just talked about. I wanted something a little more. I'm not trying to make a case for abstraction. I mean, I love abstraction, but what? I'm sorry. This is like, I'm freaking out. This never gets easier. Yeah, I wanted. I felt like I didn't want to be too literal because I wanted to work a little harder in looking and thinking, and I find that for me personally, if I'm looking at something or engaging with um, a material that's like really recognizable, my brain does like, oh, okay, like I get it. It's a one-to-one translation. Here's a visualization of the thing that I am already so familiar with. I find that I don't tend to go a lot deeper sometimes, and so I wanted, one of uh, the the Theodore Wujik work, is like, fuck. Y'all, I'm so nervous. This is like so crazy. God, I'm so tired.
Well, let me just
Yeah,
let me
yeah,
just glance in a different way.
yeah.
So, um, your work is based in a lot of love and commitment to the ideas. I mean, that's really one of the things that comes through. And the show also has a lot of that. There's all these moments of adoration um, and love in the show. Here I'm thinking of the Warhol photographs of the um, um, or the prints of the photographs of the street, or of the beautiful Barbara Smith book of the pink roses. And there's a lot of that kind of goes through the show. Like, it's about sensuality and sexuality and abstraction and the figure and all those other things, but also the artists you chose are um, performing the things that are animating them as well. And I guess maybe this is a long way of asking, like, now that you've worked with these objects for so long, which is the one that you think uh, really, kind of is sticking with you of all of the prints? Which is the one that you love the most? If that's not
That's
bad to
hard.
say.
Yeah, like asking me to like pick my favorite child. Um, I love all my children the same. I do love the white. Going back to your previous question, that one, like, it is it for me in a lot of ways, the centerpiece, and it is the spot in the vault gallery where I stood for 3 months, and so in many ways that work is sort of, proxy, surrogate. It's like it feels like I'm an extension of it. It is an extension of me. We're in this sort of like snake eating its tail relationship because there's, on that wall during the Maiden LA installation hung a work, in neon that read, "Where on earth, in which soils, and under what conditions will we bloom brilliantly and violently?" And so that became a sort of meditative anchor for me during those 3 months. It was this question that I just had in my mind, for like 9 hours a day, all summer long. And when I encountered the Charles White work, which is titled Prophet One, it felt really otherworldly and spiritual in a way that like standing on the podium did. And so having that there, in a spot where like my body is no longer standing, but energetically it's all sort of like I can't walk into that vault ever with any show without having this like very embodied reaction, this like very visceral tug in my stomach because it feels like coming home, in like the strangest way possible. I really don't know how to describe it, but it's like my relationship to that space is lifelong now, and so the Charles White work being the one that's like most legible figuratively as a black man staring or looking up at a pink flower, like it was just too perfect. I was like, this is gonna go here, it's gonna have enough space on either side. Again, I love all my children the same, but that one needed to be there, because yeah, I'm like in a way like I'm still there.
And I think that's really important to think about is that the conceptual performance of the Maiden LA piece and that endurance action is continuing because that room has been imprinted by that performance for others, but most especially for you, and that it continues even beyond. And I mean, curators spend a lot of time in their galleries, but you spent much more time being uh, interwoven with that space than even the longest term curator and their exhibition spaces. And it really feels like when you enter the space, you crafted it in such a way. But I do think when to think of the show not just as a sideline to your work, but as an extension of that performance. And the endurance performances have to end, even though they go on and on. This is a way of it continuing and transforming into something else. So go ahead.
Yeah, um, I've made this like really funny, almost familial relationship to the gallery attendants that summer, like because they also are probably the ones who understand most directly what it's like to stand in these rooms for hours at a time. And so we ended up kind of like becoming friends just because we were in there a lot of the time, just us alone for like 2 hours at a time. There would be like stretches where there was a slow museum day and people wouldn't be in the room. So it would be like me like floating in my head, like not even in my body, and then like some 24-year-old just being like, you know? And so I like ended up having this like really, I remember a few of them like thought the room was like way too intense. So like every time someone would leave, like a museum visitor would leave the vault, like they would step outside too. I think I freaked a couple of them out that summer, but yeah, anyway. But yeah, I think like to your note about the curators not being in the room as often. I think the gallery attendants for sure. So I make sure anytime I go to a museum, just try to say like hello to them as I pass. It just feels right.
And so, speaking of that room, I mean, I have to ask you about the pink, right? And because that's also part of the experience of that room and its embrace. And if we think about the show itself as staging these moments of these thresholds between bodies, um, the idea of that entering into the pink is really enveloping. But since you use pink in your work so much, I was wondering if you could both talk about your connection to that color, but then also how it's operating in the show. But let's just start with the connection.
Yeah. Again, like those neons from 2020 felt like a really fruitful starting point. I wrote this essay, or I was writing at the time. I was developing those neons, and some of the writing was trying to understand what my obsession with pink was at the time, and it did come from ruminating on like the body and all of its threshold points, like any opening in the body from outside to inside has like a certain meaty color. And so I was like, I want to live in that color. And I think that's where all of this sort of full lean into sexuality in the work came from. It was like really, really wanting to figure out like what is beyond, like what's beyond all of the things that we, our clothes, our adornments, and our skin, and again, not in the cheesy sort of we are all one on the inside kind of way, but like in the way that like there's a sort of like, I think there's one line in the essay that I wrote when I'm like trying to figure out my pink obsession, was like something to the effect of like, I want to get to that raw sticky meat sense color, and like that sort of color that if you stuck a finger inside would pink drip out, like, so it got like got really hot, but I don't think I'm a self-hating gay. I don't like, but I might, I went to Catholic school, so I might be like hella repressed, or I don't know, but that's for Dr. Duong next week. But I think at this point it hasn't entered into the work in any way other, than recently, and so I think this color has sort of like opened up a lot for me. And like I tend to be the sort of like watery crybaby, like binging The Boyfriend on Netflix and like watching rom-coms. And so I know that the history of like queer activism and queer artistry like is the sort of like artistic lanes that I've inherited um, often highlight sexuality, and I've felt sometimes that uh, hasn't always been for me, and I'm trying to understand that also. It's felt like inaccessible to me because it's just not how I operate generally in the world. I'm There was a time where I was like, am I asexual? Like, so I'm kind of like figuring out a whole lot. But this color and this show and this sort of like new form of embodiment for me and ideologically, it all feels very new and again and scary. And so I'm kind of like looking at a lot of, like the work by David Wojnarowicz in the show feels familiar and recognizable to me in a sort of yeah, like queer artist framework, but it was never something that like I connected to in my work. And so now I feel like I'm trying to maybe just like extend a hand out to my like forefathers and mothers, and trying to like start a conversation that feels a little bit delayed for me.
Well, sexuality is another thing that struggles with figuration and representation,
Mm.
because the representation of sex, ends up falling into those same sort of questions of categorization, and especially histories of queer representation have struggled to be visible other than in very conventional ways. Like, how do you represent a queer person? Usually, it's by putting them with someone who's perceived to be the same gender of them in a photograph or in a rendering. And so it is tough to think about how to to visualize the complexity of eroticism and sexuality and sensuality, and also the kind of animation of those moments of contact
Mm-hmm.
that are more than those images of a body or of bodies coupling or things like that. And so it's interesting that, again, the same dynamic that we've been talking about in your work about understanding the power of spectacle, but then also finding it exhausting or trying to find alternatives to it, is manifested specifically through this registration of sexuality and a queerly inflected sexuality. Um, pink's an interesting color in this history, right? Because it's got these gendered associations, which are not as old as we think. That are, that were shifted in the mid 20th century, where pink is assumed to be an effeminate color or feminine color. And so the embrace of it is also the embrace of that history. It's complicated, of course, by the Barbie phenomenon and the resurgence of pink in a different way.
I
But
was so mad.
yeah, I know. Like they that changed the narrative a little
Yeah.
bit. But the point is that it is a color that had been frequently denigrated or paternalistically seen as cute or sideline, and so any embrace of it is in a certain degree oppositional to that attempt to categorize. But your specific narrative of coming to it as a way of registering sensuality and queer sexuality is very interesting because it does produce this, especially in the exhibition, this sort of enveloping moment that is like an embrace. And you managed to find a huge number of works that had pink in them for your show too, which also kind of adds to that connection across very different artists themselves coming from very different positions and identities, but that you find ways to kind of sometimes almost perversely put them together or next to each other with the line of pink tracing around the exhibition. Um,
I
Go ahead.
do. I want to say, David and I have never met in person until like 2 hours ago, and I can't remember. I'm like trying to remember like when I was introduced to your work. It was within the last year, and then I saw. I like read the description of abstract bodies, and then saw the cover of the Flavin work, and then like I was like, oh my god, like he gets it, like he totally gets it. And so when the Hammer was like, hey, like, do you want to do a program? I was kind of like in my head, I was like, not really, but like if I'm going to, and then I just like cold emailed you, and I was like, hey. Do you want to do this thing with me? And you sent me an essay that you've written, and there were just so many parallels, and I was like, I feel like this is why I do what I do, this is why I make the art, because it connects me to other thinkers and makers, who allow me to feel a little more like allow me to feel seated comfortably, like in this body, in my life. And it's almost like when you see yourself and recognize yourself in another, and it just feels like, again, like coming home. And so I think like this is all kind of how I approach the show. It's how I approach making my work. It's just like I'm like seeing a thread and kind of like tugging at it to see if it'll like hold. And this was kind of like, yeah, I think we talked at dinner. Like I'm still slowly making my way through the book, but there are a lot of like parallels that I thought would be nice to just like, I don't know, throw some seeds around to see what sprouted together.
And I've really enjoyed getting to know your work more because I do see all of these same questions that I'm struggling through with in the work as well. One of the things that I've been interested in is how to do a history of um, queer queer art that doesn't fall into the cliches of visibility and what happens when we're exhausted with representation or just need a rest from being visible and all of that. And so whenever I encounter a practice like yours uh, that stakes a claim on that refusal, like with the Whitney Biennial catalog piece, it resonates for me because it's a way how, of arguing for how one can be present, how one can stand up without necessarily falling into the scrutiny of being a visible representative of a category
Mm-hmm.
or or being scrutinized
Mm-hmm.
in that way. Um,
Because we don't always have control over that. You know, we like show up and we're present and we're counted, and somebody somewhere will find some reason to try to dictate the terms of our being and try to tell our own story. And I've had enough of that, you know, even in like a field like, you know, the art world, which purports to be, you know, very we're all friends and it's all inclusive and everything's great. Like we know that there's like versions of that, but like I also sometimes feel so hyper visible and invisible simultaneously out of my control. And so some of these gestures are like me trying to assert control over, yeah, my own narrative, or like how my presence is regarded or talked about, written about. And sometimes that means not being available and being completely inaccessible, because it's not always on my terms how I'm treated or understood. And so I think it's just maybe a long form practice of becoming more assertive in my being and confident.
And it really shows, I think, in a lot of the recent work. I'd like to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But um, speaking of a kind of unexpected turn and a refusal to do what's expected, can we talk about the flower painting, which is again something that that I absolutely love this turn. Um, and for those of you who don't know, can you explain that, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, so I again 2020 COVID really fucked me up, man. I was in my apartment making these like really saccharine floral watercolors. It became a sort of ritual practice in the morning. I would wake up, make coffee, ride my bike to Exposition Park, Rose Garden, which is like a 3 mile bike ride from my apartment. And I would, and that at that time the park was still closed, so it was fenced off, caution tape. All of the parks were closed, so I would sit outside of the Rose Garden and like zoom in with my iPhone and take like really zoomed in photos of roses, and then I would ride back home and then make drawings of them. And so that became just like a, one of the survival mechanisms for that at that time for me. And so then I started doing it enough, and I was like, oh, is this why artists do this? Like, it's kind of fun. Like, I can, yeah, I'll do this, I guess. And so I wasn't even like thinking about it seriously. It just became something that I did. And it was the first time that, I'm usually making like project based artworks. It's like months long. I'm looking at a lot of stuff. I'm building, I'm trying things, and then I show up to a place and we're like installing for weeks. But this was the first time I had like a daily practice of like using my eye, using my hand, and I felt I felt like I was like, oh, I think I'm like this feels like being a real artist. You're just like making stuff. But so I started looking at all of the flower paintings from like Dutch masters and like to like your wacky like Twombly's, and I was just like, I can do this, and nobody's asking them about like, well, are these like resistance flowers? It's like, no, they're literally just flowers. And so I felt like, well, I'm going to be assertive in this regard, and I'm just going to do this because I'm enjoying it, and it's making me feel safe and anchored. And I'm sure I'm going to get and I still do get the questions about like, how does this relate to blackness or queerness or identity? And then I fall into the trap of like trying to explain that, but then, and of course I'm coming to these drawings and these paintings with my full person and like all of its complexity and dynamism. And so yes, those things are in there, but I do really just I like pink roses. I think they're beautiful. I would like to get better at drawing and painting them, and so this is where the like practice of it all comes in. But because of all of the work that has come before it, all of my work that has come before it, it's of course impossible to divorce the flower paintings from something like, the Made in LA performance, from the Studio Museum performance, where I'm laying on that platform for 3 months also. So I understand, people's impulse and again desire to want to categorize and name and fit everything into neat containers because it's easier to understand and digest. But for me, it's I'm enjoying them, and I do wish sometimes that I was allowed the same space and freedom to just make flower paintings without the seeming pressure for them to like be indicative of something else other than just what they are, you know?
Yeah, it's for them to be so quickly conscripted into some narrative about what they are representative of rather than being themselves, which is kind of what we want, what we've been talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that refusal of expectations is enough. Um, so with that, I think we better open it up to the audience and see if
Let's
there's
do
any
it.
questions. The ushers have mics and they will be calling on people if there are any questions.
I was thinking about uh, when you were talking about pink, and I wanted to ask if you think that the color pink has any relationship to peace for you.
Peace.
Peace.
Yeah, I mean, I find it really soothing. I feel it's a very soft color, and yeah, I think about all of the times that I've like wanted to maybe like pink or like it in public, and maybe felt like I haven't been able to. And so this maybe not so much the color itself is related to peace for me, but my like welcoming of it and my using it, that feels really peaceful because it feels like I'm finally able to let go a lot of, the years and years of social conditioning of like, why do you talk like that? You talk like a girl. You act like a girl. Or pink's for a girl. Like, blah, 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 blah. Like all of the things that like live in my head and body that like I don't even think about anymore, but I know it's in there. I feel like any proximity to pink and all of the years of being bullied and teased for not, sitting right in my body. I think the approach to all of that feels really peaceful. And so pink is maybe like, yeah, a symbol of peace. But hi, Robert. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you. Thank you for asking David to come because I get to see two people whose work I really admire be in conversation. And it was also nice to get a little bit of a story about how you encountered David's work. I just wanted to say, like, I was really, when I went through the exhibition, so this is more of an observation, and I guess there's a behind that is a question about your selection of the Warnerovich. Because I found myself, I'm just an artist whose work I've taught a lot. I've taught the supermarket poster works, and I saw it and felt it so differently. And it was like I got so absorbed in the story of the exhibition that by the time I got to it, I had forgotten that Warnerovich was in it. And then it was like he popped up as a surprise to me. And yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you, like, if that was something, like that kind of sense of surprise about things that popped into the show. I know that your visitors will have different surprises than you will as a curator and artist working with this stuff. But yeah, I guess that's a question about surprise.
Yeah. When I was like trying in the beginning, when I was like trying to wear, my curator hat, the title of that work is Jean Genet masturbating in Meadoway prison. And so I went through the Google deep dive and then got Genet's Miracle of the Rose, which is what this Wonderovich print is based on and that story. And so I was like reading all this stuff. I had like all these books open and I was like making notes and I was like, I don't even know if I'm actually reading this. Like it's all just kind of like swimming. And so I think the surprise for me in that work was that, because the image of like two figures masturbating on this like I think it's like ground chuck, like 89 cents a pound or something crazy. I I I wanted to I wanted to find a way to engage with like all sides of the works that I was including, and then that felt like it became like too much of like a task that I wasn't really like primed for. I didn't have them. I hadn't worked out those muscles yet to sort of like read every book and reference point of like what these artists were dealing with, and so I think that work being especially like the serving as like punctuation for the show um, sort of surprised me in a way of just like I was able to let go a little bit and just like be an artist with it, with the curation of the exhibition, rather than like the, um, like trying to do a curator's job, which they're much better at doing. An artist comes in and you're just like, I don't know, do you have any pink stuff in the collection? Like, just like so ridiculous. But yeah, I would say the more surprising thing for me, the Ruthasawa Umakichi, the print of her father, was sort of like how all of this kind of started because I was looking at so many things like newspaper broadsheets from like Central America from like the 1800s, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to do a broadsheet show. I had so many different iterations of what this show was going to be, and then one day the Ruthasawa print was just lying on a table in the Grunwald, and it was pulled out like the day before, I think, or earlier that afternoon for a class. Someone was visiting the center to look at it, and it hadn't been put back into its place yet. And so I passed it, and it felt like this tug, this thing that just like grabbed me. I didn't know who the artist was at that moment. I didn't know anything about the work, but I felt this pull, and so I was chasing that feeling over and over again. And that was basically my selection criteria for what work was going to go in the show, was that it had to make me feel something, even before knowing who made it, what year it was made, what region of the world. If I was looking at it and I felt something, then I wanted to go deeper. And I had never really allowed myself that before, even when going into museums or galleries, which is what I struggle with sometimes, even as an artist, is that um, I I, I swear I'm gonna like tie it all together. It's getting a little far flung, but I think about music a lot, and I'm not a playlist person generally. I like albums. I like the sequencing of it. I want to listen to the intro, the first track, and everything in order, and then I'm gonna read the liner notes. I want like the full package, and I think there's artistry in lining something up like that. And so I think of a lot of my installations as albums, and the individual works are the tracks of the album. And so this show also serves like that because I know when I hear something musically, I know within seconds if I like it or not. I don't need to know like who the producer is or what the musician did before, like if they went to a conservatory. Like I don't really care about all of that. I feel the music and then I go for it. Art operates differently. It's so much up here for me, or it's like trained to be up here for me. And I don't always like trust this. I trust this way more than I trust what's happening up here. And so I wanted this show to kind of be maybe just like, yeah, an allowance of that. Like, if I like it, I want to know more. Yeah. Yeah.
You just made me think about the roller coasters, right? And just like what that feeling is, right? That I went down the whole YouTube thing of the roller coaster subculture of people,
It's deep.
and it's just like that feeling when the bottom falls out and you're like falling, flying, and all of that. Everything that you just said reminded me of that, and what you give to people through that project. So sorry, that was not a question.
I love it. Thank you.
Can you? Okay, you can hear me. The exhibit was beautiful, and I still very vividly remember the Gabe performance.
Oh, shout out, Gabe.
Yeah, my partner and I both have the flyer or the poster in our respective creative spaces. It was a very meaningful night. I'm curious to hear more about what you said about the Whitney and your catalog, and I love this idea about withholding and keeping what's precious to us private in a world where I feel as if, as artists, I'm a writer, like what you share publicly is what we're taught is what validates. So I'm very moved by what you said. I've spent 8 years being very public with my writing and have been very called to just be very quiet. So I'm curious what grounds you in that, and how, how do you remain in that space with confidence? Because I imagine that there must be some practices that you have that keep you tethered to that belief in a world that wants us to think that we're defined by everything that happens externally.
Damn. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm. Um, we were just talking about this moments ago before at dinner. I have this book that I come to over and over and over again. It's titled "Tell Them I Said No" by Martin Herbert, and it's a collection of essays, 10 essays on 10 different artists who have either completely removed themselves from the art world, or they've developed an antagonistic position to its mechanisms, or they're constantly in a mode of refusal, or they're just like, yeah, refuseniks in one way or another. And so David Hammons obviously is one of the chapters. Katie Nolan, Agnes Martin, Stanley Brown, who had a show here not too long ago, or yeah, works here. Um, who else? There are others, but I read this book because it feels really permissive, and all 10 of them have and had a completely different approach to refusal. But the common theme in all of the chapters is kind of like all of these artists sort of like earned the right to like step away. Like they put in some work, and got to a point where like if they left, I don't know, maybe it would be okay, but I also think like, this is my life and I want to be happy, and if this thing stops making me happy, I will have no problem walking away from this and finding something else. Like I don't feel locked into this at all. And so I think the thing that grounds me are the people in my life, be it friends or family, who may or may not work in this field. They have like the world is so big. There's so many different types of people in it, so many different places, and what we're doing up here, I love, and it feeds me spiritually, mentally, emotionally, in all of the ways that I need to be fed right now. But as I get older and the further that I get into what now is like my literal job, like this is my career, like it's no longer just me like expressing myself. I do that too, but this is also how I pay my rent. And so like the stakes feel, and I understand, I know that I'm in a very privileged position to be able to say that like I am a working artist and this is like what I do for a living. But I'm not at all under the illusion that this is the only path for me. And so I ground myself in so many other ways that have nothing to do with this, because I think life should be full and fun and loving.
And more than it appears from the outside, which is
Mm-hmm.
very much kind of what we've been talking about. With that, I'm going to say thank you, EJ, and thank you to all for coming. And
Thank you, David.
it's a beautiful show, and yeah, thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all.